so much. Ta-da. All right. Thank you. All right. Let's start with where computing actually got started in the ancient days of what we call key punch machines. And they used to use key punch machines to clear checks for decades. Okay. Now I'm going to zoom in on this. Now, you don't have to know what this is, but I'm curious to see if anybody knows what it is. Feel free to either just speak up or put it in chat. I'm pretty informal.
It's a punch card.
Exactly. It's a punch card. And the way the punch cards worked is you put one statement of either COBOL or Fortran onto a punch card. And there were data entry people that would take your, in this case, a Fortran coding sheet. This Fortran coding sheet goes back several decades. My gosh, maybe half a century. And you would write out your code on this piece of paper. So you had to have the program running in your head before you even did anything with anything else. So you'd write it out, and then the data entry person would take your coding sheet and type it in, because there was only one terminal that had a monstrous mechanical keyboard that punched holes in the punch cards. And then you got a stack of punch cards that allowed you to run your program one statement at a time. So it was not terribly efficient, nor was it fast. But here's an example of some of the creative things that people have done with punch cards over the years. This looks like an aardvark, but again, small punch cards. But this is where it started. And what happened was the storage mediums began to change. So they realized that, you know what, it's just ones and zeros, and we're doing all these ones and zeros on the computer. So why don't we do something and try to store it on some magnetic disk? Because what they discovered is that I don't have any of it right now. They long been recycled, but I'm going to draw a very fast approximation of what old school memory looked like. And what you had, now I want you to think in terms of wires and electricity and magnetism. Okay. Now this is very poor representation. But basically what you had is little circles. Those little circles were basically, they called them toroids, and they were little magnets that went around the juncture of those two wires. And then based on the signals that came in over here and over here, you could program this to be a 1, this to be a 0, based on the polarity of how the magnetic charge was stored in this core memory. Once they realized that they could use magnetism to store ones and zeros, that's when things got started. That's when things went nuts. Okay. Things started going really, really crazy. In the beginning, before hard drives, we had tape. Now, this is, let me zoom back out a little bit so you can kind of see this. And this has a message on it that says deglossed, declassified. It looks like tape inside a VHS. In fact, that's what it is. It's basically mylar, a plastic substrate with an iron oxide surface. This is still used today. Platforms have changed, but they're still using magnetic stuff to store data. Okay. And we're starting to see a subtle shift into non-volatile RAM, but SSD drives still store everything in with magnetic ones and zeros. And you know, these non-volatile drives, they do the same thing. It's still stored with ones and zeros. Okay. Some of the chemistry is different, but this tape drive is how you would load your program and save your program. So you got away from punch cards now. You could use a tape. Problem with tape is it's sequential. You have to load your program and then you load your data. And sometimes the tapes, oftentimes, were separate. You had one data tape and one program tape. So you had to load the program into the computer so you could run the program, and then you could run the data tape to run the data, and then you process it to save the output onto another tape. Okay. So the basic cycle of computing, input, output, and processing, has not changed since computing was actually invented with Alan Turing and his thought experiment of how to do computing with a long chain. It's worth a read. I think the original paper is from 1953, or actually maybe even before then. But he worked at Bletchley Park and helped break the Enigma machine. But as tape evolved, they created higher densities and they got smaller. Then they went into these cartridges. And these cartridges you probably don't see much anymore. But IBM keeps selling tape drives. Why? Well, they've got a tape drive now that's about the size of a 4x6 card and about 2 inches deep that stores, I think, 14 petabytes data on a single tape. So for cheap storage that has a shelf life of centuries, tape is still the way to go. It's still really effective. But most companies like Google and you know, they move so fast, they don't need for legacy history. There's no reason they need to save their DOS 311 machines, right? So they use a lot of hard drive, what they call tier 1 storage, which is fiber optic driven storage, which is extremely fast. Okay. So it started with punch cards, moved to tape. Then we moved into these other fun little things called tape hard drives. And this is a hard drive from a few decades ago. We zoom out. This is what we would call a disk pack. And this disk pack, you would unscrew the bottom and you would basically take this. The handle is broken on this one, but you would take this, put it into this big filing cabinet, and then you'd set it in very gently and you'd push it in very gently. And then you'd slowly spin up the drive, and then the drive would spin at pretty high speeds. And then this was your general ledger, or this was your AP, or this was your quarterly statements. Again, Fortran and COBOL. And sometimes business basic, depending on the hardware you're using. But you can Google how much this stuff held compared to the data storage of today. It's actually, it's hard to fathom the amount of storage that can be stored today compared to back in the day. Now, when I was hired at Foster Farms in 1997, they had rooms and rooms and rooms of these things. So what happened with Foster's, they were in the process of migrating all that stuff into modern hard drives. Well, I should say more modern hard drives, because this is an evolution of the big disk pack. And then I like showing this this book. Here, let me move this out of the way and zoom in on it. This is decommissioned from a grade school library And this book was written in, I believe, 86. And it says how to become a computer operator. I can be a computer. It's a kid's book. And I found this and I said, hey, I want this, because it shows some really cool pictures of the way computing was actually done in the 80s. So this was, I wouldn't call it state of the art 1986, but maybe state of the art 1984. And you will notice the size of everything. It's just huge. And then it goes through and it has a fun little story of what you can do with computers, wow, wow, wow. And nowadays, if you don't know computers, you're kind of out of luck. Every job, you have to know computers. So you can see, notice the terminals. This is an old Tandy Trash 80, as we called it. It was an 8-bit machine, and you had to load your programs from a cassette tape, and then you could run them and then save it back to a cassette tape. And more, this stuff, here's your tape drives. So you can see this was, this is what it was all about. And when these machines first came out, here's something that I find interesting. Let me give you a piece of use here. When they first created ATM machines, the biggest bill you could get out of an ATM machine was a $5 bill. Okay. Now, when you go to the ATM machine, you ask for, I don't know, $300, $400 of cash, they will give it to you in 50s. So yes, there's inflation. And the thing that is, what we see in the news today is everybody's panicked about this, 3, 4, 5, 6% inflation. The fact of the matter is there's inflation since the time of the Egyptians at 4% per year. It's just the way of life, inflation happens. Okay. And then this is an example of a Commodore 64. And these were fun little machines. They were actually color, and you could program games, and you'd again save it to disc tape or cassette tape. It was so slow. The what you can do online today is just so much faster, and then so on and so forth. So you can see it wasn't that great. The good old days weren't so great. Okay. And you can just, so kind of fun, but the technology, as it progressed on disk drives, we started moving condensed. When they realized they could miniaturize things, they started miniaturizing hard drives. And here's an example of a half height 5 1/4 inch hard drive. I don't have any this high. And when they were, wow, 20 megabytes of data. Oh my gosh, that was so cool to have 20 megabytes of data. But these hard drives are sealed. So what happens is, again, you have some sort of substrate, in this case, aluminum, covered with, you got it, iron oxide material. And these heads will change very small places to ones and zeros or positive, negative. So you can store your data. This is why if you use a really strong magnet, you can track your hard drive, okay? Because it erases everything. All right. So now we have, even smaller, faster drives, and not down to a laptop drive. And they are still using the same idea, heads going over a substrate, and they're making it denser and denser and denser and smaller. I saw a 20 terabyte hard drive that was, I don't know, $400 or so. I'm going, oh my gosh, we would have died for that kind of storage in those old days. It didn't even exist theoretically. and they keep breaking new grounds with miniaturization. That's the magic, is the miniaturization of everything has made computing that we know today possible. Okay. So we have hard drives. Now let's pop into something that you may sort of remember, and I'll kind of go backwards on this one. Oh, I need to show this too. I'll bring this out. Let me show that. Okay. And let me put this here. How many remember these things? Floppy drives. Well, you know, we got so many tech support calls saying that's not a floppy drive, it's a hard drive. See, the outside's hard. And we try to tell people, well, it's the inside is still floppy. If you break it apart, it's still floppy. And here's what happens when you put a 3 1/4 on your dashboard. Kind of melts. Data irrecoverable, all gone. And then before that, we had 5 1/4. And I got into the business when they were using 8-inch floppies and 5 1/4-inch floppies. And these floppies look like this. And the way this works is this actually spins this Mylar piece. It's like tape, okay? Except it spins inside of the sheath here, and it writes 1s and 0s. And the way this works is you put it into your drive, you flip the lever, which is long gone, and it pushes it down. And then notice this is the head. It actually touches the magnetic substrate and it changes it. I remember the floppy drives. We were really thrilled at dual-sided floppy drive that could do 360 kilobytes. Okay. And, you know, hundreds and hundreds. When I first started Linux, I kid you not, I got a box from Rice University with 50 of those things. And I had to load all 50 onto my hard drive. And if you got a bad one, oh, guess what? You had to call them and say, hey, can you ship me some more floppies? I got a bad one. And that was kernel 0.99. And we're up to what, 510 now? So it's 0.99. Yeah, it was pretty rough. It was very difficult to use, but hey, you know, it opened the doors for some major computing. And so with the floppy drive, and they did, after they had some fun with getting the basics out of Linux on 0.99 kernel, people got really clever on how they could put it onto a single 3.5-inch drive, and they were actually created floppy distributions that you could run an entire Linux system off a single floppy. If you take your 2 seconds and go to and do a Google on Tiny Core Linux, you will see the results of some of these wonderful ideas. Tiny Core Linux can be loaded into 10 megabytes. And you're going, well, who would use that? Amazon. Amazon uses Tiny Core, a hacked up version of it, for all of their scan guns. Okay. Before the 5 1/4-inch floppies, we had 8-inch floppies. So you can see that, yeah, that's why they call them floppy. Okay. And for the most part, they worked. And then we used to carry oscilloscopes, and then we would take the heads and we'd try to get the heads to mesh over the drive so your drives would work between machines. And oh, it was so tedious. Now, this is the guts of a hard drive. See all those lovely scratches? That's what we call a head crash. This was out of a 1 gigabyte Fujitsu SCSI drive. And I was thinking about that. The small system, it's SCSI, small computing systems interface. You ever heard of iSCSI? Well, SCSI was invented in the 60s, and it's still used and it's very reliable. One of the things about SCSI is you see this board on the back of this? With SCSI, there's enough intelligence on the drive from the bus of the thing. You had a buffer. You can look at the buffer and disconnect it from the bus, and it will sit there and write out all, or read it all into the buffer, and then you can burst it back. So SCSI's been around a long time, but most people don't get down to that low assembly level on SCSI. But I actually know that pretty well because I spent many years troubleshooting at that level various drives. I'll show you that next. What happened here is that the head turned. So the head was flying along here and it turned, and it's ground into the data. So needless to say, all the data is gone. And that is, you never want to hear that. When you hear this loud screeching, like a raptor or like a bird of prey coming in on, screaming away, yeah, that's what it sounds like. And you're going, oh man, there goes all my data. And you sit there and you cry softly, trying to saying, where's my restore from my previous backup? Okay. All right. Now, as I'm looking at all my hardware junk, I need to figure out where I am in my talk. So we went through floppies, went through hard drives, and let's talk a little bit about miniaturization right now. Then I'll talk about that. So I'll use these guys, this and this. And I think I showed you this. This is the fiber optic cable. This is what, I don't know if you heard the story about the fellow that worked at Facebook. He found a Chinese engineer and he outsourced his job to the Chinese engineer. So he was making, 6 digits, and he's paid the engineer in China, and, I don't know, maybe a quarter of his salary, or who knows, maybe, I don't know what the actual numbers were. But the security team comes up and knocks on his QB and says, why are your credentials being logged in every day at coming in from China? Needless to say, he was set free to pursue other opportunities. His work life consisted of looking at cat videos. Apparently, the Chinese guy did pretty well. I bet you Facebook probably hired him. But fiber optic allows you to do that. There's virtually no delay from anywhere you are on the planet. And yeah, yes, do your homework because somebody in China wants your job. That's kind of the way, you say that to put fear in people. But there's actually a better secret to the equation is if you know the business you're in. Let's say you're really good with medicine and you're a top-notch doctor, nurse, whatever. You really know your field, but you also know computing. You can bridge the gap between the business and the IT knowledge. That job will never be out, especially if you can write a complete sentence with subjects and verbs and periods and commas and everything. Okay. The students that I've had that have shot up the ranks the fastest are the ones that know another discipline and can write. Okay. Now, writing does not mean you have to be a published author, just like knowing how to program doesn't make you a programmer. But knowing how to get your thoughts on paper so somebody else understands where you're coming from is an extremely important job skill. And it's also a ticket to the bigger money. This little black dot, that is a single transistor. Okay. That is a single transistor. So then the miniaturization of this stuff, I have some old, here's 128 megabytes, and here's a 256 megabyte flash drive, USB 1.0, mind you. This is a transistor and that's a transistor. Okay. So the number of transistors in your iPhone, I think at last count was 8 billion. Can you imagine that? Billion with a B. And we wonder why your phone is so smart. There is so much horsepower in your cell phone. It's unbelievable compared to the technology we had in the past. Now, there is a website called MYNOR, Minor, and I can't tell you if it is org or .com, but the guy is a software hardware engineer of, I would say, very accomplished. Here's the complete schematic of a fully functioning 2-transistor computer. If you want to learn about computer engineering and the low-level stuff, and you build this, you're going to be at the top of your game, because you're going to understand things that how do you get software to do this in hardware, and how do you get the hardware to recognize the software? He's got, you can run games, albeit they're not fancy games. He's got a calculator for it. He's an assembler for this, and he's written a compiler for it. The guy's, I would call him a genius, but it's really amazing to see what he did with 2 transistors. And he built an entire working computer. So that's pretty amazing, considering you have 8 billion transistors in your cell phone. Kind of hard to believe. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about the, well, since I'm on the transistor thing, how they're made. This is what they call leftover slag from a chunk of silicone. They take these things and they make giant hot dog looking things, and they slice it off, and then they run it through all kinds of processing. Okay. So this chunk of glass and silicon basically is what makes your chips. This is a 8-inch wafer full of chips. Now, I don't know what's on there, but I think they're the Intel math processor. So back in the day, you have to get floating point to work, you had to buy an extra chip that would process floating point, because converting floating point into discrete systems takes a lot of horsepower. Okay. And back in the day, the only way they could do that was put it in its own chip. Now, each one of those little squares is the guts of a chip. And the way this works is that each one of those little squares goes inside of this packaging. Okay. And this is 32-bit. Wow. 1 core. Okay. Notice all the pins on the back. If you've built a computer, these pins are very critical. Very easy to pin, put it into the socket wrong, and then you ruined your chip and you got to go buy another one. Today's chips have way more pins, and they're much finer in detail, and they generate a lot more heat. Okay. Because when you start putting all these transistors into a single packaging unit, it starts generating a lot of heat. Okay. And that's one of the problems in computing is, yeah, we can go faster, but we have to cool it. And then you come up with these weird ideas saying, hey, let's use water. Let's use this. Let's use that. Or let's see, I've got one laying around here somewhere. or use a heat sink. Looks like this. This heat sink, those tubes are filled with water. So you just hope your heat sink doesn't leak, right? Because then that would cause all kinds of headaches, right? So this is kind of where computing has come from over the years, and what we have and what's evolving. Okay. And I have a couple of more things to show that come out of my past working in technology. I happen to be exceptionally fortunate that I got a high-tech job in the 80s in the Central Valley. The Central Valley was a desert when it came to technology. Okay. But I got involved with the technology during the days of the worm drive. This is a worm drive. It's glass. Okay. And they would use a to fire onto this thing to store your, basically they called it 2 out of 9. So they created 3 rows of 3, and then they would blast 2 of them. And that would be a binary representation of one of the digits. Okay. Think of it, the letter A had one, uppercase had another one, and so on. So 2 out of 9 give you all sorts of permutations to be able to represent most American ASCII characters. Okay. The reason this technology kind of vaporized was 2 reasons. The mindset of the business under lock-in. You buy from us, you only buy from us, and therefore we don't play well with others. Okay. I can fill a whiteboard of companies that use that business model and are now out of business. Okay. The play well with others is a survival skill in business. You have to play well with others. But this technology, these started out with 12-inch, and they would store things like legal documents, because once they wrote it, you could not change it. Okay. So there was no way to fudge the data, because you could always go back to the original version because it was never changed. It's not like a hard drive where you change a document and you save it. The changes, unless you turn on logging, are lost. The hard drive doesn't know, when you flip a magnetic bit, it doesn't know what it was before. But when you burn holes with a laser, you can't change them. Okay. Well, there were, I can't remember how many, but there was at least 10 or so companies that were making these 12-inch hard drives. And they made these big optical jukeboxes that were mechanical nightmares that would move these things up and down and put them into the drive. And that's what I got to teach I was the technical trainer for this company to teach people how to fix these things. So I had to teach them how to use a SCSI bus at a very low level to write diagnostics, and how to use a serial interface at a very low level to be able to manipulate the jukebox. Well, what killed the industry was you could get company A and their drive and their media, but none of it, not even the software, would work with company B or company C. Nobody worked with anybody. And it made a really nice side business for companies that would actually transfer media from one drive to another. And guess what? You can still make a living importing and exporting data from one database into another database. Those days, I don't think will ever go away, because database technology keeps improving. So you need to save your data, and then you got to load it up into the new database. Well, after the 12-inch drives, they created these. And now we even had more vendors. There was like 20 or 30 vendors in this arena. And there was one and only one standard, the case. So I could put a 5 1/4 inch worm drive. You can see how that looks. It's kind of a little hard to see, but there's little lines in there. This is hard sector data. And this held 5.2 gigabytes. That's it. 5.2 gigabytes of worm. Write once, read many. And it was lasers that did the same thing, except this is on plastic. And the 20 vendors, none of them worked with each other. They realized that they needed to start that. But by the time they figured out that they must play well with others, along came the CD-ROM with standards. And, you know, Panasonic and Sony and Toshiba all agreed that, hey, let's use this CD-ROM thing and let's make a standard. And then like overnight, this whole thing just kind of vaporized. And it was like, yeah. So people learned the hard way that you got to learn to play well with others. Okay. All right. So I've a couple more things that are on the fun category. Gotten through all this. All right. Here's a I think I showed this to you last time. Anybody remember? Kind of, sort of.
Yep, that's some sort of dial-up modem, wasn't it?
Yep.
I remember someone
An
mentioned
old
that last
dial-up
week.
modem. You put your phone on it and you could connect to the internet at 300 baud, which was really slow compared to today. Okay. Now we're talking megabits, 100 megabits, gigabit, 10 gigabit. But this is an acoustic coupler modem. Okay. So yeah, Hayes modems. If you look up on Google, Hayes modem command set, and you look it up, your cell phone is still using the Hayes modem command set when you make a phone call over 2G, 3G, 4G, or 5G. Okay. It's, you know, it's like, who needs to know that? Well, the people that are creating cell phones that are going into the next version. Here's an old one. And here's another old one. Yeah. So it's come a long way, huh? Now they have built-in cameras and motion sensors and accelerometers. I was talking to a pilot, and he was showing me the his iPad, and he had one of the higher end iPads that has all the GPS stuff built into it. And he had his FlightAware software. He could program this thing in, and on his iPad, he had everything a commercial airliner had. It was unbelievable how much processing power they could put into the iPad to actually tell you where to fly your plane, how to fly your plane. It was pretty amazing. Okay. This is an old PC, somewhat gutted. And this is the socket that you put your chip in. Now, notice it's a lot of little tiny holes in it. Okay. So when you put your chip in, it's very important that you put it in correctly, because if you bend the pins, you're stuck. Okay. There's no coming back from that failure. Epic fail. And here's another one. This is another Dell. Here's some heat sink slots. Slots. All this good fun stuff. Good old SMC for networking. Now, this is why we don't repair chips. Okay. If I can, I'll go down to, let's see, right off. Looks like over here. How about that? Yeah, right there. I know this is really hard to see, but these components are so tiny Yes, you can solder and unsolder them, but you need a $10,000 soldering iron to be able to do it. And it uses hot air. And it takes a very fine surgeon's type touch to be able to remove and replace this thing and still work. Okay. But for the most part, people don't even bother fixing a board. They just send it off, recycle it, and then they go get another one. Okay. I sent my brother a computer back in the 90s. He still uses it. He uses it for his dial-up Juno account. I'm what you call state-of-the-art type person. I keep up. My brother is what you call the absolute antithesis of that. His computer pass, every time he turns it on, he has to set the date. It defaults to 1981. Replaced his battery that stores that information multiple times, but the machine is just too old. You know, what year 2000? And when you talk to COBOL programmers, you know what? We never thought our code was going to last 50 years. Yeah. So it's not surprising, because when I worked at Foster's, I did some stuff with their payroll printing, and it was literally the oldest computer in the enterprise that printed all the payroll checks. And it was like an act of God to get that thing upgraded. And then when I finally pulled in all the managers, I did a whiteboard sketch of how we printed checks. One of the managers said, it's a miracle we print anything at all, because it was really hackneyed. I mean, it was a hack. It was, 20 years of temporary fixes. Okay. Here's a mouse, a dead mouse. Notice the things that are missing. Little balls inside the mouse roll these little wheels that look like saw, like a circular saw. There's little notches in them, and on either side of the notch, it's a little hard to see, but you have this white and black sensor. Let's see if I can. I can't do that. There we go. This white and black, clear and dark. One is a sender, one's a receiver. And then what it does is when you spin this, it flashes. So it knows how many steps it's moved in one direction or the other. Okay. That process is still the same. And it was originally on this. This is an optical mouse. And this mouse pad had to go with your optical mouse. And it was, so when you moved it, the little grid on the mouse pad told you where you were going. It didn't have the sensitivity built into the chips on the mice. Well, we all know now that mice do this. They're optical now, and it doesn't really matter what kind of surface you're on, as long as it's kind of uniform and you can move your mouse around and it works. Okay. It's still the same idea. It's just how it's implemented. It's all ones and zeros. Okay. Now, as I move my leftovers here from point A to point B, I have one or two more things to show you. We have 25 pin serial ports and a switch. Hey, I need to print. Can you push it to G or F? Yeah, this is how network printing used to work. Honest to God, this was network printing. It didn't exist. And printing, printers and I hate each other. We've had this love-hate relationship as long as I've been in technology. Printers have always been an interesting thorn in my side, because now printers have a whole different mechanism, and they make it basically really simple for people to connect. Well, there was a a hacker conference a few years ago, DEF CON in Las Vegas, and they flew a drone with some antennas by office buildings, and it could snarf the printing traffic. Running payroll to a wireless print. You get a copy of all of that while you're printing it with my little flyby drone. It was quite the undertaking. And I go, oh my gosh. So, you know, when you have sensitive things to print, don't use wireless for obvious reasons, unless you're going to use a switch network of some sort where you can't break into it. But I thought that was amusing. But printers nowadays make life a lot easier, and you can now print to a PDF or print to XPF. One of the things that gave me my biggest raise was a shell script. I don't know if this is going to show up here. I'll do it this way. I got a whole box of this paper for a dot matrix. I don't know if you can see that, but basically it says at space minus sign greater than, it's the Unix redirect, $temp, which means give me my current working process ID and create a file called whatever, 9999.tmp. That gave me a huge raise. What was I doing? What did I do? Well, in 97, when I got hired at Foster Farms, every department I visited was printing stuff out on the mainframe on Greenbar and rekeying it into Excel spreadsheets. If you took Excel away from Foster's, the company, you will find that just about anywhere. So if you know Excel at a reasonable level, is definitely a good job skill to have. Okay. But why did it give me a huge raise? Well, think about a time that it took for people to print and rekey everything across the entire company. So this was part of a subsystem on one of the machines, this part of the spooler. So I made it part of one of the printer options. So when you print, instead of printing to hard copy, you'd print email. And then they got their text stuff in an email message, and then they just brought it right into Excel. The amount of hours that saved, and in paper costs, and in keeping these 1,200 line printers, you know, the amount of printing just dropped virtually. I won't say overnight. It took time to train people how to use it. Because there were some disadvantages. The disadvantage is you could only be logged in to the system once in order for this to work. Some people really didn't like that, but I said, well, here's the advantage. How much time do you spend rekeying data from the mainframe? A lot. I said, well, if you log in and send it to this printer, you don't have to do that anymore. They became believers like overnight. And then they told their friends, and then their friends too. And then soon enough, word got back to management and gave me a nice raise. But what is that? That's just Linux stuff. That's Unix stuff. And I've been twisting the bits on this stuff since forever, as long as I remember. Since Linux kernel 0.999 or 0.9, 0.99.9. Okay. All right. And the very last thing I want to talk about is keyboards. To me, in the world of keyboards, you know, there's a lot of, you know, gamers like their mechanical keyboards. They like this. Let me zoom out a little for this one. I'm not that picky. I'll pick a keyboard and I'll just, I personally like keyboards that are quiet. The loud clicking, because I sometimes work late at night and it bothers the animals and it wakes up my wife and so on and so forth. So I like the quieter keyboards. But this to me was the greatest invention. They didn't fall out. Wonderful. Well, in the old days, it would fall out and you'd have, 104 key pickup. It was, and they would sit there and you put them back together with a little spring, hold them and use a special tool to put them in place. And people want to go back to that. I'm going, well, good for you. I'm not picky. Okay. This is how a keyboard works. This keyboard is the grand silicone. It's silicone with little bumps in it. And these little bumps have a little nib in it. Okay. And the nib pushes on these little squares and these little circles. And those little circle dots are separate. There's 3 pieces of Mylar here, the base, the middle, and the top. And the Mylar holds them apart. Okay. So when you use the nib and you press on a circle, it hits the key. And then it goes to your key processor and it says, oh, you typed in the letter A. And that gets sent down your wire and it gets plugged into your computer and boom, there's A. Well, when I first started out in the world of computing, I came from the background of being very mechanical. I worked on cars and copy machines, and I traveled all over the valley fixing copy machines, which were basically glorified computers that made copies, and very mechanical and lots of toner everywhere and blah, blah, blah. I learned a lot, but the ability to troubleshoot mechanical things is part of the reason my boss hired me when I started working at my first computer firm. And I also gave him free copy repair for the whole time I was there, which saved him a bunch of money because copy machines in those days were not cheap. You'd pay literally thousands of dollars a year to have your machine serviced and maintained by a qualified factory tech. So I was a really cheap hire. So they trained me. And one of my earlier calls was out to a tortilla factory in Chowchilla, which is no longer there. Okay. But what was happening, the trouble call said, hey, you know what? My keys don't work pretty much around this side of the keyboard is not working. So I very carefully pull out all my keyboard tools and remove the board with the keys so I didn't have to mess with all the keys falling on the floor. And then I started getting in there and cleaning out, and it was pretty dusty. And then I peel back the covers, so to speak. And along this side, there was a big smushed roach. Yes, it was a roach, an insect, squished. What he had done, or she, I don't know, the bug had crawled in and somebody started typing and squished him. So I cleaned out his guts, well, from the keyboard anyway. And then I put it all back together and then it worked. And then they said, what'd you do to fix it? I had to tell them, you had a bug in it. Yeah, joke. That is not the true story of why we use the term bug in computing, but it's my story. And it's also a true story. And that made the keyboard work. Okay. So on that note, I've pretty much covered everything regarding the show and tell of hardware. Okay. So let me zoom out and come on. Yeah, you can't go too fast. All right. So we have the past of where we've come. We've had, keyboards and, hard drives, transistors, and fiber optic. To me, when fiber optic cables, it's a gift that keeps on giving. They are now multiplexing fiber to use different colors of the rainbow to increase the amount of bandwidth that they can put on a single fiber. And they keep coming up to theoretical limits, but they don't have to change the fiber. They only have to change the switches end, which is, you know, when you have an undersea cable and you don't have to change it and you just change the switches and you double your bandwidth, that's a huge win for everybody. Okay. So, and then where we came from, all this fun stuff. Okay. Now I'll open it up for questions if anybody has any. And if you're interested a little bit more about this, I'll put it in the chat. Did I invent print queues? Heavens no. Being able to print to disk, print to email, or one of the ones that really got me raised at another company was print to HTML, which by the way, you know, Microsoft now does. You can save your Word document to an HTML document. They figured it out finally. You know, it's like, oh, what this is a good idea. You know, good ideas percolate to the top. You know, they have a tendency to stick around. Okay, in the chat message, I am going to put something for you to look up. It's from Wired magazine, and it's called Ray Holt and what was it? I think he called it Secret First CPU. Okay. Ray Holt was a electronics engineer with extremely strong discrete structures. Shall we say he was a math major who concentrated in discrete structures. If you read the article closely, see why the Tomcat, the F-14, was so advanced. Because what he did is he took all the analog inputs from flying an F-14 Tomcat, put it into an avionics computer that was run by ones and zeros. Well, mapping an analog bank that is elliptical and rolling like you're spinning up is difficult. You really got to know discrete structures at a deep level to be able, or discrete math, if I was to be technical about it, to be able to map that into electronics. But he did. And he was actually ahead of the game when it came to TI and Intel and their 4004 chip, Texas Instruments, all the rest of them. But because it was military, it was underneath this auspices of secrecy. And then in those days, they also had a binding agreement that when you stopped working on it, you couldn't say anything about it for another 25 years or so. I think those days are pretty much gone. As you can tell by the books, you know, people, you know, they get out of the military, then they do a tell-all book. And so some of those binding arrangements aren't around as binding as they used to be. But it's a fascinating read because of what he did and how he did it with the tools of the day. You know, it was, I found the article, it's much more of a human article. It's about how this lady knew about him and death and so on and so forth. But the story of how they invented the avionics computer for the Tomcat changed avionics forever. Okay. And I found that to be really interesting because that whole thing is happening now again all over in self-driving cars. Ones and zeros, discrete math, convert it to electronics, You can do anything. Okay. Just add time and money, usually large quantities of both. Okay. All right. Oh, there we go. Yeah, posted in Slack. Thank you. Thank you for finding it. It's a really interesting article. I find, I'll reread it and think, man, those good old days were really, really hard. Because you were designing something that had never been done before. When you do a self-driving car, it's kind of been done before because you have self-flying airplanes. Okay. The old DC-10 from the 80s, it was pretty analog, but the pilot could use 2 fingers and program the computer and hit go, and the thing would fly, take its route, and land. The only thing it wouldn't do is take you to the gate. And I do know, in talking to pilots, I come from a family of pilots, so kind of a thing for me is that the pilots of today, as soon as they take off, they hit the autopilot, and the autopilot has a name. His name is George. So the reason they do that is that George flies the plane more efficiently than a human. So pilots don't get as much stick time as they used to, because all they're doing is literally getting the plane off the ground. Because do they need to be done there for that? No, you can actually program it to take off. You can program it to land. But pilots like to fly planes, so they give them the permission to fly it and land it. But when you're in the sky going between New York and Florida, George is running the plane. Okay. So, all right. Other questions? All right. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It gets LASIK to be a fighter pilot. It used to be in the days of yore, if you didn't have 20/20, they wouldn't even let you get in as a pilot, commercial or fighter wise. Well, nowadays they've kind of loosened up those rules because there's not enough pilots. So as long as you're correctable to 20/20, you can fly. Okay. Not so for private pilots or sport pilots. You can be blind as a bat and still fly. Okay. Fly your paraglider. It's all by feel, right? Okay. All right. Okay. Any questions? All right. Now, let's see. I'm supposed to go to 12:35. What I would like to do is, what I will do now is I will turn off the camera, and then I'll go to a screen share and show you a little bit about virtualization. Now, I use virtualization. I bring it to the class for all my classes, because virtualization is one of those job skills that you really can't take a class on virtualization. And my classes kind of have this show and tell element to it. Is, hey, here's something out in the real world. You might want to take a look at it. That's all it is. You can follow up on it on your own if you want, or not. No harm, no foul. It's just that I'm trying to make you aware of some of the possibilities that are open to you. In the world of computing, trying to decide what you want to do can be quite difficult. Do I want to do networking? Do I want to do hardware? Do I want software? Do I want to do full stack? Do I want to do databases? Do I want to do this? You've got so many options. It's hard to know what you like or don't like until you get out there and you realize, I don't like this. And then you try something else. Okay. So that's kind of my goal with this. So let me go and turn this on and go to screen share. And this should, I hope, turn off the camera. There we go. You should now see a VMware workstation window open. Okay. Now, I think what I will do is I'll stop the recording here, and then I'll start it again right away. Okay. But in order to do that, I have to do this. I have to hit stop share. Then I can do stop recording. All right. So that was old hardware.